and welcome to Coming of Age Stories. I will be your host, Sarah Westgarth, as we talk about all things growing up. I've been a teacher for almost 11 years now, about to hit my anniversary in just a few days actually, and I've worked with kids and young people for a very long time. I've taught musical holiday workshops and performed as a fairy at birthday parties and taught preschoolers all the way up to 18-year-olds. I even had a short-lived stint as a youth pastor. I've been a school counsellor and a youth theatre director and a passionate fan of Sesame Street. I'm fascinated by those important early years of our lives and think we often deeply underestimate them. And particularly at this time, this bizarre, tumultuous year we're having, I keep thinking about the kids growing up right now. The ones who will remember having their schooling disrupted because of a pandemic, or who took time off school to demand government action on climate change, or who took to the streets to stand up against institutional racism. How is this shaping them? I kind of can't wait to find out. So this is going to be about all things coming of age, from fairy tales to first loves to neurodevelopment to John Green books. I really appreciate you joining me for the very first episode where I'm going to talk about what childhood actually is and the beliefs that I think are kind of toxic about it, and also about adolescence and what we mean by that and why I think we're so hard on teenagers. Just a quick content warning, I do discuss child abuse a little in this episode. Nothing in detail or anything graphic, and not for very long, but just be mindful of that. I also want to acknowledge my own very limited perspective when discussing such universal concepts like what it's like to be a kid. When I talk about society, I'm going to be talking about the one that I grew up in. I do want to further delve into concepts and experiences of childhood in other cultures further down the line, but that will definitely be in conversation with people far more knowledgeable than me and with lived experience. So here, my views are going to reflect on growing up in Australia and being largely influenced by Western culture. But I'm very conscious of not presenting an entirely unchallenged Eurocentric perspective. Okay, so this is it, my first episode. If you like it, please share and follow and subscribe and review and all that jazz. The podcast is on Instagram and Twitter at Coming of Age Cast, and on Facebook as well. All right, here we go. The children now love luxury. They have bad manners, contempt for authority. They show disrespect for elders and love chatter in the place of exercise. You might have heard this before. It's a quote that summarizes the general attitude of young people these days, but then has this twist of being attributed to Socrates or Plato, demonstrating that these views are not new and teenagers have always been teenagers. That's a great narrative. Though, tragically, the quote doesn't date as far back as we would really like it to. It is about ancient Greece, but it's generally found to be a reworking of a line in a dissertation about the education system of that time by Kenneth John Freeman, published in 1907. I still like to use this quote with my students to show them that the complaints about their generation are nothing new. While Socrates may not have said anything exactly like this, the quote still goes back over 100 years, and is discussing schooling at that time. And we do have another assessment of youth by Aristotle from the 4th century BC. Young people are high-minded because they have not yet been humbled by life, nor have they experienced the force of circumstances. They think they know everything and are always quite sure about it. There are plenty of other similar ideas you can find in writings throughout time. And I'm sure I don't need to tell you the prevalence with which dismissive attitudes towards adolescents are thrown around, often in major, widely read publications. I'm a high school teacher, and I've worked with kids and teenagers for a long time, and they're all too aware of the way their thoughts and feelings or actions are often considered lesser. One of the most obvious recent examples of this has been the school climate strikes, sparked by the 17-year-old activist Greta Thunberg. Comments from opinion columnists and even members of parliament were critical of students who chose to attend the protests, claiming they were either just wanting to skip school, victims of brainwashing lefty teachers, or were far better off in the classroom where real learning could be done. Anyone who actually spends any significant time with teenagers, including myself, was left pretty outraged by this. While people who consider teenagers in the abstract rely on the stereotypes of them being lazy and selfish and not up to the task of sitting at the grown-ups table, I spend over 7 hours a day with people who are clever and passionate and kind and sensitive and more than capable of making their own decisions and forming their own opinions about the world. And they know what's being said about them. After all, they have access to more information than any other previous generation, and they're not particularly happy about it, particularly when it seems like the expectations of them are inconsistent. On the one hand, they're too young to be discussing politics or demanding any kind of change. But on the other, they're highly criticized for any mistakes or choices they make that might be deemed reckless or irresponsible. I work with teenagers who can't go to the bathroom without permission while being asked to decide what they want to do for the rest of their lives. It's somewhat understandable that lines do get blurred during adolescence. This time period that we consider a person young has become extended throughout the last century in particular as lifestyle and society has changed. Kids are in school longer, they stay at home longer, they get married later. And despite these changes coming from positive developments in our society like access to universal education and having more options in life, this extension of our youth often becomes part of the criticism that back in the day when young people had to go to work as soon as they physically could, it meant they were tougher or more resilient and more community-minded. The idea of feeling nostalgic for the days of child labor and other exploitative practices is kind of mind-boggling to me, but whatever. There's a prevailing idea that kids these days are soft and not resilient. People point to them changing jobs more than previous generations, or the higher rates of mental illness diagnosis, or that more of them are asking to be identified by their own pronouns. No, they're not the same kids who were shipped off to fight in global conflicts of the past, or work god-awful hours sweeping chimneys. And I think it's pointless to compare them, as they, like everyone, are a completely unique product of their particular place in time and history. In order for us to understand them, we have to understand their context. You might be able to tell that I'm about to lay out two seemingly contradictory arguments. One is that young people and kids and teenagers these days are exactly the same as they've always been. That perceived laziness or arrogance at suddenly knowing everything or showing disrespect, these seem to be the traits that every generation complains about the one that comes after them. But on the flip side, I believe that this current generation of young people are also entirely unique, facing pressures and having experiences unlike any other generation before them, and they need to be understood within that perspective. A pretty common descriptor for young people these days that I hear a lot is entitled, which I find really interesting. Now, I'm not here to entirely debunk all these stereotypes. I've known teenagers who are lazy and selfish and entitled. I've known a lot of adults who fit those descriptors too. What I am here to do is encourage the imagining of young people to be as complex as they are and to avoid reducing them to cliches, and definitely not to dismiss them. So my opinion typically tends towards one of multitudes. Teenagers nowadays are just the same as they've always been, even if we don't have a quote from Socrates to back that up. At the same time that those coming of age in the new millennium, or the millennium for those of you who want to pay it its due respect, have a set of completely distinctive challenges to face. They're different. It's impossible for them not to be. But this idea of entitlement I find really interesting because as far as I can see, it comes from young people being aware and conscious of their rights. And considering that the idea of children having rights is actually a fairly new concept, it seems kind of absurd to now resent them for it. In the early 20th century, the idea of child protection or child's rights didn't exist. Until then, societally, children were considered more like property than people. Now, I'm not about to go through the entire history of the fight for children's rights, but I'm going to give you a few highlights. In 1924, the League of Nations adopts what they called the Geneva Declaration of the Rights of a Child, and this was drafted by the founder of the Save the Children Fund. So this declaration articulates that all people owe children the right to the means for their own development, special help in times of need, priority for relief, economic freedom and protection from exploitation, and an upbringing that instills consciousness and duty. So the Geneva Declaration on the Rights of the Child says, the child must be given the means requisite for its normal development, both materially and spiritually. The child that is hungry must be fed. The child that is sick must be nursed. The child that is backward must be helped. The delinquent child must be reclaimed. And the orphan and the waif must be sheltered and succoured. The child must be the first to receive relief in times of distress. The child must be put in a position to earn a livelihood and must be protected against every form of exploitation. The child must be brought up in the consciousness that its talents must be devoted to the service of its fellow men. In 1946, the United Nations General Assembly established the International Children's Emergency Fund, UNICEF, with an emphasis on helping children throughout the world. Then in 1948, the United Nations General Assembly passes the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, in which Article 25 entitles mothers and children the right to special care and assistance and social protection. Then, in 1959, the United Nations General Assembly once again adopts the Declaration of the Rights of the Child, which recognises, among other rights, the children's rights to education, play, a supportive environment, and healthcare. This was an expansion on the Geneva Declaration on the Rights of the Child from 1924 and distilled them down to 10 principles. Principle 1. The child should enjoy all the rights set forth in this declaration. Every child, without exception whatsoever, shall be entitled to these rights, without distinction or discrimination on account of race, colour, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth or other status, whether of themselves or their family. Principle 2. The child shall enjoy special protection and shall be given opportunities and facilities by law and by other means to enable them to develop physically, mentally, morally, spiritually, and socially in a healthy and normal manner and in conditions of freedom and dignity. In the enactment of laws for this purpose, the best interests of the child shall be the paramount consideration. Principle 3. The child shall be entitled from their birth to a name and a nationality. Principle 4. The child shall enjoy the benefits of social security. They shall be entitled to grow and develop in health. To this end, special care and protection shall be provided both to them and to their mother, including adequate prenatal and postnatal care. The child shall have the right to adequate nutrition, housing, recreation, and medical services. Principle 5. The child who is physically, mentally, or socially handicapped shall be given the special treatment, education, and care required by their particular condition. Principle 6. The child, for the full and harmonious development of their personality, needs love and understanding. They shall, wherever possible, grow up in the care and under the responsibility of their parents, and in any case, in the atmosphere of affection and of moral and material security. A child of tender years shall not, save in exceptional circumstances, be separated from their mother. Society and the public authority shall have the duty to extend particular care to children without a family and to those without adequate means of support. Principle 7. The child is entitled to receive education, which shall be free and compulsory, at least in the elementary stages. They shall be given an education which will promote their general culture and enable them, on the basis of equal opportunity, to develop their abilities, their individual judgment, and their sense of moral and social responsibility, and to become a useful member of society. The best interests of the child shall be the guiding principle of those responsible for their education and guidance. That responsibility lies in the first place with their parents. The child shall have full opportunity for play and recreation, which should be directed to the same purposes as education. Society and the public authority shall endeavour to promote the enjoyment of this right. Principle 8. The child shall in all circumstances be among the first to receive protection and relief. Principle 9. The child shall be protected against all forms of neglect, cruelty, and exploitation. They shall not be the subject of traffic in any form. The child shall not be admitted to employment before an appropriate minimum age. They shall in no case be caused or permitted to engage in any occupation or employment which would prejudice their health, their education, or interfere with their physical, mental, or moral development. And Principle 10. The child should be protected from practices which may foster racial, religious, and any form of discrimination. They should be brought up in a spirit of understanding, tolerant friendship among people, peace, and universal brotherhood, and in full consciousness that their energy and talents shall be devoted to the service of their fellow human beings. In 1973, the International Labour Organization adopts Convention 138, which set 18 as the minimum age for undertaking work that might be hazardous to a person's health, safety, or morals. In 1985, the UN put in these standard minimum rules for juvenile justice and outlined the principles of a justice system that promotes the best interest of a child, including education and social services and proportional treatment of child detainees. And then in 1989, the Conventions on the Rights of the Child was adopted by the United Nations. This has been widely acclaimed as a huge landmark achievement for human rights. It recognises the role of children as social, economic, political, civil, and cultural actors, and it guarantees and sets minimum standards for the protection of the rights of children. All of this information comes from unicef.org, and I'm not going to read the Convention on the Rights of the Child because it's quite long, but I encourage you to read it if you find any of this in any way interesting. So what all of these milestones and documents ratify is that a child has needs that are different to that of an adult, and they deserve and need our protection. It acknowledges their developmental needs and the responsibility society has to ensure their safety and well-being. Now, maybe there's an argument to be made that acknowledging that children are vulnerable and have rights has made them less tough. But personally, I reject that notion that toughness and being willing to be shoved up a chimney makes for better future citizens. This move towards recognizing children as people has altered the way we as a society think about the young and shaped the kind of experiences they have during this time period. Compulsory completion of school, for example, has only really been around for 150 years or so in our parts of the world, and even less in some places. What also comes alongside this is not only the idea that children are particularly vulnerable and shouldn't be forced into labour or combat, but also the acknowledgement that child abuse exists. There's documented evidence of what we would now easily identify as the mistreatment of children throughout all of recorded human history. But it wasn't the subject of professional medical or psychological inquiry until the 1960s. Yeah, take a sec to think about that. When we wax nostalgic about the resilient and tough children who survived World War I and the plague and whatever else, and say how current generations are all weak snowflakes who are too sensitive, which, side note, I think is debatable as a concept, we ignore the fact that this is a time period in which a parent beating their children was either not thought of as possible or not considered a problem. So the concept of child abuse really is first acknowledged in a publication of a paper called The Battered Child Syndrome, which is credited to the pediatric psychiatrist C. Henry Kemp and was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association in July 1962. And this is the moment when child mistreatment entered mainstream awareness. Before that, if children were injured, even with repeated bone fractures, that wasn't commonly recognized as the result of any kind of intentional mistreatment or trauma. Instead, doctors would look for an undiagnosed disease or would just accept the stories of an accident or being assaulted by a bully. Acknowledging that parents or other close people to children were capable of hurting them was a really important thing for people to be aware of. One of the earliest documented cases of widespread acknowledgement of child abuse did come a little before this, and that's in the story of Mary Ellen Wilson. So, Mary Ellen was born in 1864 in New York, and once her father died, her mother Frances wasn't able to raise her because she had to work. So Mary Ellen boarded with a woman named Martha Score. When Frances was no longer able to make the childcare payments, Mary Ellen was turned over to the state care system. She was 2 years old at the time. She was fostered by a couple, Thomas and Mary McCormick, And this seems to have been done illegally. The department did no paperwork and made no records of this adoption whatsoever. Thomas then died, and Mary remarried a man named Francis Connolly. While Mary Ellen lived with Francis and Mary, she suffered horrific abuse. She was forced to do heavy labour. She was beaten, burned, cut, and locked up, to just name a few things. This was eventually exposed by a neighbour who asked a missionary friend of theirs to check in on the family. Etta Angel Wheeler went to their home and immediately saw pretty striking evidence of abuse and neglect. And Etta started researching ways she could help Mary Ellen. But there were not a lot of options available. There were child cruelty laws, but no one was really willing to act on them. So Etta turned to the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, and it was with their help that they were able to get Mary Ellen removed from the home and take Mary to court. Mary Ellen was 10 years old at the time, and Mary was found guilty of assault and battery and sentenced to a year in prison. That year, the New York Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children was founded, and that was the first organization of its kind. The happy ending to that story is, while at first Mary Ellen was placed in a juvenile home, she was then adopted by Etta Wheeler, the woman who'd rescued her, and she lived until the age of 92. So, in the late 1800s, there was no recourse for children who were being abused. And then we didn't have this legitimate academic acknowledgement of it until the 1960s. And even then, there still came this reluctance to believe it, especially because the perpetrators tend to be family members, which is too horrible for a lot of people to contemplate. This is why we prefer to think more about children getting snatched from random creeps in vans or joining satanic cults because they're listening to Metallica. We don't want to see that the call is usually coming from inside the house. Now, there is so much to unpack in all of that, and I intend to do an entire episode talking about child abuse at one point. But the point I want to make for now is about putting our perspective of young people in this historical context. How interesting it is to spend a century fighting for their status to be acknowledged as worth protecting, and then balking when they want to stand up for those rights. Children were barely considered more than property not that long ago. That's not to say everyone always saw them that way, or that people of the past didn't love and respect their kids. Definitely not saying that. But when we step back from individual cases and look at the societal view of children, I think about how we collectively realize that there was a problem with children being abused and exploited, and we fought collectively for their rights and their ability to have a childhood and acknowledge that that was important, only to now yell at them for being idealistic and aware of those rights and believing that they have autonomy. Now, all children are not perfect. There are plenty that do suffer due to overindulgence. But this taps into a pretty defining feature of childhood and adolescence, and that is how little power they actually have. How much they are reliant on and defined by the environment they are exposed to and raised in. How formative our early years are. I am constantly struck by how much of who we are and who we become is dependent on the guidance we are given as kids and the experiences that shape us, and how young people often feel trapped in their circumstances with not much they can do about it until they are acknowledged as an adult. That's going to be a big part of what this podcast is about. Now, this doesn't mean we are limited by our childhoods by any means, nor is it about absolving people of responsibility of their actions later in life or even as kids. What I am trying to get at is how crucial it is to acknowledge the vulnerability of children. When we dismiss their needs or their feelings or their rights, we can do such serious damage. Children and young people deserve to be protected and guided and raised with respect, so they do feel empowered about their own rights. And in saying that, what I think people forget is that teenagers fall into this same category. Because most of that attitude about kids these days is directed at adolescents. The teens you see hanging out in parking lots or in the mall or serving you at Macca's or striking from school to protest for government action on climate change. It can be hard for us to imagine these people as vulnerable, whether it's because they look physically imposing, some of my students tower over me, or because of the loud and sometimes obnoxious ways they express themselves. Teenagers rarely do things by halves. When they love something, they love it. And we can see that in the crowd screaming at a One Direction concert, or a wall covered in posters, or the hours they might spend playing a video game. Everything they feel is big, and that's because it is. The time of adolescence is a huge time of change when their body goes weird and their emotions go nuts, and they have so many significant experiences for the first time, like falling in love, or knowing someone who dies, or having friendship difficulties, or having sex. And while we all experience this, it can be easy to forget as we move into adulthood and look down on teens with scorn or derision, or roll our eyes at their dramatics. The amount of times I've heard adults dismiss things that usually involve a lot of feelings or high stakes emotions as high school bullshit, or derisively use phrases like teen angst. It's dismissive of such a huge experience and really significant time in our lives. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about what's actually going on in a teenager's brain. Early in adolescence, people develop this sense of really concrete black and white thinking. Things are either awesome or awful. And this can be largely explained by their neurodevelopment. The prefrontal cortex doesn't fully develop until you're into your 20s. This is the part of our brain that helps us make complex decisions and control our impulses. It allows us to consider consequences. Adolescents are simply not able to step back and see the big picture a lot of the time. It's very hard for them to sacrifice pleasure now for the sake of a long-term goal, or consider the risks in a behavior that seems fun. Also, the limbic system of our brain is also still developing. And this is the part of us that helps keep our emotions in check and to regulate our sleep. So I read this paper called Adolescence as a Unique Developmental Period by Natalia Jaworski, PhD, and Glenda McQueen, MD, PhD. And I just want to read a few extracts from that paper that I found really interesting. In the broader sense, adolescence refers to the period marking the transition from childhood to adulthood. Historically, this typically spans from 12 to 18 years, which roughly corresponds to the time of pubertal onset, specifically hormonal changes, to guardian independence, and that's the legal definition of adulthood in many countries. Adolescence frequently co-occurs with puberty and is associated with a period of increased risk-taking behaviors as well as increased emotional reactivity. This is typically coincident with changes in the social and school environment, such as spending less time with parents and more with peers, as well as an increase in autonomy. These behavioral changes occur in the context of developmental changes that are influenced by both external environment and internal factors that elicit and reinforce these behaviors. Adolescence is temporally confined but not fixed. It should be conceptualized as a developmental period rather than a temporal snapshot, as it is highly variable behaviorally and developmentally. Neuroimaging studies have provided us with a new understanding of human brain development and activity during adolescence. This work further emphasizes the fact that adolescence is a unique period relative to both childhood and adulthood, rather than a linear progression from one to the other. Morphometric and imaging analyses have also been linked with behavioral data in animal and human studies. Behaviorally, non-human adolescents tend to exhibit increased novelty seeking, peer interactions, and hedonic behaviors. Similarly, human adolescents make risky choices and exhibit greater emotional reactivity than either children or adults. A primary cognitive feature defining the progression through adolescence is the ability to control your impulses and delay gratification in favor of goal-directed and more optimized outcomes. The accumulating data indicates that adolescent behavior is differentially biased in motivationally charged contexts compared with adult behavior. Basically, sensitivity to rewards peaks during adolescence. So all this to say is that the data supports the fact that teenagers have a really difficult time making decisions. They have poor impulse control. They feel things so much stronger than children and adults. It's hard for them to delay pleasure now for the sake of a long-term goal. And that is all hardwired into their brains. The paper then goes on to talk about tailoring mental illness treatment to adolescents and how a lot of the treatment of mental illness in young people isn't actually taking any of that into consideration and treating them just like adults, and the impact that that can potentially have on treating depression and anxiety in young people when it manifests differently, which I thought was really interesting and I think will also be a topic for another time. There are also gender differences in brain development during adolescence that I'm not going to get into now either, but that adds a whole other wrinkle to what's going on up there. We then combine all of that with the adolescent's tendency to start becoming more independent. They might push away their guardians in order to be who they are on their own and to figure that out, and whatever that means. They often become extremely self-conscious as the need for acceptance by their peers becomes so important. Not to mention the fact that they will become expected to make more adult decisions that have significant consequences, like in their relationships or their education or learning to drive. How they handle all of this is going to be hugely influenced by the environment, like I talked about before. While lots of teens grow up in supportive families or have people to help them with this stuff, many of them don't. The World Health Organization, where I got most of this information, summarizes what all of this means when it comes to dealing with teenagers. So what we actually need to take away. What they say is their implications for policies and programs are that the changes that take place during adolescence are just 9 observations. Adolescents need explicit attention. Adolescents are not all the same. Some adolescents are particularly vulnerable. Adolescent development has implications for adolescent health. Adolescent development has health implications throughout life. The changes during adolescence affect how they think and act. Adolescents need to understand the processes taking place during their own adolescence. To contribute positively, adults need to understand the processes taking place at this time. And public health and human rights converge around concepts of adolescent development. Those points are kind of the foundation for what I want this podcast to be about. I want to explore the experience of growing up, both universally and at this particular place and time in history. I want to talk about the importance of our early formative experiences and how they shape us. I want to talk about kids' media and classic coming-of-age stories and young adult books. I want to talk to people about their childhood and what high school was like for them and hear their unique stories and how they informed who they became. I want to talk about what makes a young person vulnerable and what we can do to support them better. Because when we do that, the world becomes a better place. On that note, I want to start with, or end with, discouraging you from having a dismissive attitude towards young people for so many reasons. I've been thinking a lot about the contempt people feel for teenagers, whether it's mocking their latest obsession or criticizing the way they talk or claiming their relationships are just silly drama. We have some of our most important experiences of our lives at this time, and the relationships we have then form the blueprint for our adult lives. And all of us at that time probably made some really dumb decisions that still make us cringe. While our brains are still figuring out what a risk was and making us feel our emotions deeper than they probably warranted, we did stuff we would never do now. And so we want to distance ourselves from our teenage selves as much as possible. In doing so, we cast this bad light on all young people, that they are stupid and selfish and reckless. But in understanding the kids these days, we also need to understand our own young selves. And we need to forgive them. What I've learned in working with young people and also the work I've done on myself as I've reflected on my experiences in my youth is that we all did the best we could with the information we had at the time. We can acknowledge the choices we make when we're younger are not good ones without hating ourselves for them and without disparaging the emotional lives of all young people. Because I genuinely think we all still have that awkward, emotional, angsty, yes, a little selfish, but longing to be accepted teen inside of us. And they deserve our compassion and our understanding and our acceptance. So I'll hope you'll come along with me as we learn to do that. as we learn to understand the youth of today a little better, but also ourselves. Thanks for listening. Keep growing up.